All right, this part of the program is going to be different from the rest. This is not going to be so much of a panel as it's going to be a freewheeling keynote conversation between two of my favorite high-powered heretics and the conversation. My name's Joel Garrow. In my previous life, I covered technology's impact on culture, values, and society for the Washington Post since approximately the Coolidge administration. In my current life, I'm a Lincoln professor, yet another Lincoln professor at Arizona State University, and a fellow here at New America. So I was involved in creating this unholy shotgun marriage between the two institutions that led to this marvelous future tense fellowship. But as I say, the thing that's the biggest honor for me about being involved in this conversation is that I get to deal with world-class heretics here. As you've learned, David Keith is not only one of the godfathers of geoengineering, but what you may not know is that he once wrote a paper about how wind power can destroy the climate. You gotta love this, right? Huh? I mean, this is really, this is world-class. And Stewart, of course, is not only he is one of the godfathers of the environmental movement. He back in the day, back in the 60s, he decided to do this astonishing piece of social engineering where he noticed that the dominant visual image of the age was the mushroom cloud, and he decided he was going to single-handedly change that globally. And so he ended up basically not only lobbying NASA, but the planet to replace this visual image with the little blue ball, and this was of the planet Earth, and this was, you know, the campaign about why haven't we seen a photo of the whole Earth, and that led to the Whole Earth catalog and the National Book Award for which he won. So now Stewart, in his classic counterintuitive fashion, is the author of this book, which has just came out in paperback, Whole Earth Discipline: Why Dense Cities, Nuclear Power, Transgenic Crops, Restored Wild Lands, and Geoengineering are necessary. And what's really dangerous about this is that Stewart has the guts to now be telling his progeny in the environmental movement that it's time to grow up. As a father, I can't think of anything more dangerous. So I plan to just be an agent provocateur, not a moderator here. And so let me start with, I was talking to William Gibson, the visionary novelist who invented the phrase cyberspace, and I was telling him about this event, and he said he had a question that he wanted to ask, which was, sulfuric acid cannons pointing straight up. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, I see us probably progressing over the next decade or so from how dangerous and crazy to how dangerous and necessary. What do you think, David?
Nothing could possibly go wrong. It's easy. I have two, if I imagine that I make it to 2050, which I just might if I'm lucky, I have two sorts of fears that are really the opposite. One is sort of the runaway scenario, and one's the regret scenario. So the runaway scenario is that right now, actually the conversation about geoengineering has been, in a way, remarkably informed with a bunch of pretty thoughtful, environmentally oriented people trying to get social science and governance to happen. But I could imagine a total techno runaway, where once people get started with all these knobs manipulating the planet, and there's lots of ideas, they'll just go nuts. And we won't stop at trying to reduce the effects of CO2. We'll want to actually have planetary augmentation to make it better for things we care about. I mean, this is a guess. It might be wrong, but if you want to maximize global crop productivity, there's a good guess that you'd actually rather have higher CO2, but then taper off the temperature with a little geoengineering. I'm not advocating that, not at all. But so my worry about runaways is that people will just get into kind of wholesale, let's just manipulate the whole thing to try and make it better for whoever is in charge. But the regret scenario is that it turns out that the kind of optimists about these technologies were right in the sense, not that they fix everything, they can't, but that they actually can provide some real environmental benefit, and that we didn't use it because it seemed we were too politically correct. We were too scared to touch it. And I think we'll feel stupid if we look back in 2050, having hopefully cut emissions a little bit, and realized, we could have actually prevented a significant chunk of that Arctic melting and some other impacts, including some changes in precip, if we'd done a little bit of this, and we didn't because we were just afraid to go there. And I think I can imagine either regrets with sort of equal probability, but they're both things to avoid.
I thought the panels this morning were great, and one of the things that kept coming up is how about some clarity on goals? And it occurs to me, as an environmentalist, I think my ideal goal would be that it's sort of like abortion, that geoengineering should be safe, legal, and rare, and if deployed, temporary. That the idea would be that it would be used only to buy time, not to take on the role of perpetually managing the atmosphere and the climate, but to assume that Gaia, the standard Earth system processes, have been pretty good at it so far. We screwed it up. Our job is to unscrew what we screwed up and then step back and let the natural systems do their expert job. Is that plausible, or is it too late for that?
No, I don't think it's too late. You can think about this as sort of peak shaving. If you decouple the question of how much we're going to cut emissions from the geoengineering question, which I know you can't politically, but if you did and you assume that we actually are going to do what we should do to cut emissions, and we'll have one day where global CO2 concentrations peak. I'm hoping it's before 2050 and we'll have global celebrations, and after that we're rolling over the hill and concentrations are going down. Whatever that peak happens to be at, that's a decision about how hard we cut emissions. What seems likely but not certain is that we would have less environmental impact as a species if, leaving that peak, we also smoothly shaved off some solar radiation. Not enough to fully compensate, but some. So I think it's thinking about that as a temporary peak shaving is certainly the only way I'm comfortable thinking about it. But even then, we don't know enough now to say for sure we can do that.
Well, what's the long term here? I mean, we sort of stretch our minds and get all the way to the mid-century and then stretch really hard and get to 2100, but actually time doesn't stop, and especially climate doesn't stop in that time frame. The sun keeps getting warmer. It's been doing it for quite a while. Gaia supposedly has kept us relatively in hand in terms of temperature, but in the course of time, we are headed toward Venus as a really unlivable way to have too much CO2. What's the long-term geoengineering prospect?
That's a great question, and you've done a nice job thinking about that with the Long Now book. I guess I think in the very long run, if humans don't wipe themselves out with a big war, which I think is a pretty real possibility, that we will have an engineered planet. An engineered planet in the sense that isn't nature anymore. Just the kind of sense that Bill McKibben went after, that nowadays when you look at what the temperature is, the answer is sort of a natural process, and at some point it won't be. It'll be a political process that told you that. But I personally think that, as is true with cell phones and all sorts of other things, technology evolves much quicker than our social ability to handle it. And I hope that day of living an engineered planet is centuries off, and that for the next while we focus on learning how to mitigate and reduce our impact before we plunge into a kind of fully engineered artificial planet. But on the time scale of the sun getting hotter, I'm pretty comfortable with the idea we shield some of that sunlight using technologies like this to avoid having us boil away.
Now, the thing that came up this morning, the only one planet, and you mustn't do a bunch of these experiments at the same time because they'll confuse each other. It occurs to me that and Professor Schilling was getting into the sort of, there's some of this that you can do incrementally. And the question I had was, say, cloud whitening, which we haven't talked about much, but I know that in many ways the science is much more iffy on that than it is on the putting sulfates in the stratosphere. And because I've been to some of those meetings, and we had the point made that Jeff made that the Chinese have been cloud seeding for a long time, and it seems to solve some political solution, but doesn't technically accomplish anything. And indeed, the U.S. has been through that a time or two, and militarily and whatnot. The existence proof, as you remember, on cloud whitening is that where ships go in the ocean, there are these cloud trails that they leave behind under certain weather conditions. And what if we could do that on purpose and thereby make basically a whiter stratocumulus over the oceans and thereby increase the albedo and all those good things? One of the ideas there is an experiment at scale would not be for the whole damn planet, but for an area off a western coast in South America or off of California would be a good place to try it. See if it works. See if it has local effect.
California's a great place. There's no lawyers there.
There you go. What do lawyers have to do with this? Explain.
Nothing.
Yeah, right. Well, that's the big question: is liabilities.
Sorry, go on.
The liability issues, right? I mean, this whole thing basically is fucked, and we're all going to die. So, can you do stratospheric stuff by stages? Can you do low stratosphere in the, say, the Arctic polar region? Get a season or two of some kind of effect that which you can measure, doesn't influence everybody, doesn't change the monsoon. Can you do that?
I think the short answer is no. The climate is really pretty coupled together, or it's not much. So the idea that one person can turn the climate knob in one way and another country gets to choose a totally different climate, I think that is close to theoretically impossible, even with some advanced geoengineering.
But you can find out some of the linkages, which is what we're trying to learn.
Yes. So there's two. So one thing, as Tom Schelling said, is there are two sorts of experiments you might want to do. One are to do with sort of processes. I mean, can you make the right kind of particles, and do they cause cancer or kill birds or what have you? And the other question is, does this thing have the kind of effect you want on the climate, and what are the surprises? And for that first set, it's clear there's a whole lot of experiments you could do at a scale where the environmental impact experiments was less than this meeting, and I didn't make that up. I've calculated that, and so have other people. So there's lots of things you could do to go after. Does this cloud whitening actually whiten clouds? And you could do that with an environmental impact less than all of you flying here, for sure. But that won't tell you the large-scale climate response. To do that, you actually have to work your way up to something that you are doing at scale.
But my sense is the climatologists are mixed on this because they've had an observational science all this time. They haven't gotten to do any experiments. And one of the great potential scientific side effects of these things is that they are experiments. You perturb the system, and then you see what happens. How cool. What could possibly go wrong with that?
I think that's an underrated good, and maybe that's because I'm a lab physicist by training, and lab physicists often don't know enough theory. That's a secret. I shouldn't have let it out. And so we have these ways where we have a big nonlinear system, and we wiggle something, and then we watch the result and see if it's correlated with the wiggling, and we can learn a lot if it is. We have fancy names for that aren't called wiggling. But there are lots of examples where we've done quick perturbations and learned a lot about them. So one of the ways that we know how the ocean absorbs heat and carbon dioxide is from a marvelous positive consequence of the bomb tests, and actually the test ban treaty, because we had a very accelerating rate of bomb tests, and we shut them off, thank God, and that deposited a nice even layer of radioactivity on the whole oceans, which turns out to be a really useful tracer now to see how water diffuses into the ocean. Nobody would have advocated this in their right mind, but it's been very useful. Likewise, the fact of having no airplanes in the air over 9/11 was a pretty useful but not definitive experiment to show how high aircraft can produce a radiative forcing that warms the climate. There's lots of other examples like that. So if you get to manipulate the system a little bit, you can learn some things you never or almost never could have learned by observation. And I think that, in fact, in thinking about kind of interactive or what's the word I'm looking for? Responsive, interactive management, we could do much better than we're doing now. So forget climate for a second. Crucial public health question. There's no question fine particles are killing a lot of our fellow Americans and making them sick. Fine air pollution. But it's actually quite unclear right now, and somebody may know this better than me in the audience to correct me, how much of that is due to coal-fired power plants or cars, or there's some other combination sources, and it's quite hard to pick it apart epidemiologically. We could arrange to just alter the dispatch, how much, say, coal-fired power plants are turned on and off, in ways that we know exactly how to do and what it would cost. Put a little modulation in it, and then watch for that modulation in the hospital admission records, and help to pick apart the signals. I'm imagining some people wouldn't like this, but you could do that. But to be clear, we already learn a lot from watching the weekly and annual cycles of hospital emissions versus air pollution. That's how we know there's a basic problem. And if we try to separate the sources like that, we could start to nail the problem. But if you propose that, you get laughed at. I'm not adding any risk here. I'm altering the risks in a controlled experiment way to try and figure out what the cause is.
Now, you've talked about ways to get basically sulfur dust into the stratosphere. And I had a conversation with Sir Richard Branson a couple years ago. And he was talking to Jim Lovelock about this quite a while ago. And Branson said, oh, let me see if I got this straight. All I've got to do is go back to dirty fuel in my planes and I can save the world.
No. Commercial aircraft spend almost all their time too low. And so if you just put, there's several reasons why that's wrong. One is that there are actually issues with the sulfur interacting with the blades in the aircraft engine, so you couldn't just put that much sulfur in the fuels. And second of all, they're not in the right place. So now if you're going to do this, you'd want to build specific aircraft to do it, which would cost you a tiny fraction of what the current aircraft fleet costs.
Does this mean you don't buy the stratoshield idea coming out of Nathan Merpel and those guys to put up blimp-supported hoses?
Well, I mean, the number one thing to say is there's not been a lot of work done. And so we need, you need a real research program that has been open and transparent, and you'll start to sort those questions out. But my guess as of now is that it doesn't make much sense for two reasons. One is that with a hose, you tend to put everything in one place. And several papers have now showed if you just spray sulfur in one place, it really is ineffective because it all clumps together, to be glib about it. And the other thing is we've paid a bunch of engineers who had no particular bias about the answer to trade off a bunch of these things, and they found that the hose solution didn't look very cheap when they analyzed it.
Can I jump in here for a second? This is heading in an interesting direction because you're talking about private individuals, like Branson and stuff. So, David, you're spending most of the private money that's been brought to bear here, right? On your Dr. Greenfinger.
So I'm going to back up there several.
And by the way, Stuart, you know every one of the California zillionaires who might be willing to jump in and try to save the world.
Especially if Washington seems to be at all dilatory. It's like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and everybody else has decided that NASA is never going to get off its butt, and therefore they're going to have their own space program. That's going to happen with this stuff, just as sure as you can bet, and it already is. I guess you're getting Gates money.
Yeah, the SpaceX story really is something. They've developed a heavy lift launcher for less cost than it took NASA to build the gantry, the thing that would have stood beside NASA's new. I'm not making that up. It really is stunning. It should make you really think about how successful we are at managing big technologies as a government now. So it's the job of the provocateur to provoke, but I want to push back or qualify two things.
Not that you don't like the Gates money.
No. Gates does give money in a purely philanthropic way to a committee that Ken Caldera and I are both involved in. And it's a committee. It's not just me making the decisions. And it also runs under a whole bunch of rules that are philanthropic, so Gates gets no benefit out of it. And we're now completely public about this. This thing has a web address. It's called the Fund for Innovative Climate and Energy Research, and we've now said exactly what the rules are and who got funded. And it's hard to know the fraction, but it was certainly some of the money. I mean, we've done lots of things other than geoengineering. This isn't geoengineering alone by any means. But we have put some money into this, And it is a representation of government not acting. But to be clear, we've also put money into the attempts to think about regulation. So the SRMGI, this governance initiative, has some money from that and some others.
Is the Canadian government all interested in what you're doing?
The Canadian government, I don't think has been that interested. It's interesting. So I'm happy to take money, say, from Gates, because I don't think he has any particular obvious interest one way or the other. I actually really respect his motives in this, and he has a track record of being a serious philanthropist, obviously, who also thinks, obviously, very deeply, more than I, about the conditions of the poor people in the world. Obviously, not everybody agrees with what he's doing, but it's clear he's thought about it very, very deeply. I have avoided taking any money or having any interaction with the town in which I live on this topic. I live in Calgary, one of the biggest oil towns in the world, because it's sort of so obvious that some people in the oil industry see this as a way to avoid action. So I just don't basically talk about it in my town on that topic.
Have they?
And that's more or less true of the government too, actually.
Have any of them actually approached you?
Yeah, there are people who are. Yeah, yes, sure.
Well. Interesting.
But no, I think it's really crucial for all the reasons you've heard in various ways that the beginning of this is it's so important to actually get real input and governance in a way that has not just talk. That I think it's actually crucial to do this in a way that's not commercial for the sort of core high leverage technologies. So I do some work that's commercial on other things, but I do nothing that's commercial or has any IP associated with this solar radiation management stuff.
But you do have something commercial going with carbon dioxide removal.
That's correct.
Would you spell that out? Because we haven't had much carbon dioxide removal here, and we should.
Well, yeah, no, in a room like this with all these people, you can get 1,000 ppm CO2 in the air, and it makes us all tired. Yeah, so I run a startup company. There's a handful of them around the company, around the world. I run one of what I think is the best one, trying to develop large-scale technologies for taking CO2 out of the air. This is a very high-risk venture, and so that is in a classic a startup company mode, and it's I got to say a huge amount of fun because in a startup company people really have a very shared goal.
What's your technology, if any?
So we're trying to do this in a way that this is as much as possible scaling off things that are already heavy industrial processes. We don't have to change that much. So we're working with industrial cooling tower manufacturers to adapt the way they build cooling towers, and then with technologies really developed from pulp and paper and the lime industry. And it's those two coupled together that allow you to do this at scale. But what the cost is unknown even to us. I mean, that's in a sense what we're spending the money to find out. And this is now a hotly disputed issue where some people say confidently it costs thousands of dollars a ton, or at least 500, and other people say confidently it costs 20. I think it's neither of those numbers, but in the sort of $100 to $200 or $300 range. But the honest truth is, until we've really done the engineering, neither we nor anybody else knows. Because, and this is crucial, academic professors or spokesmen aren't the one who define prices. You actually have to go build stuff and figure it out.
Will it scale? I mean, I wonder this about all of the carbon dioxide, including biochar. Will biochar scale? Will any of these things scale?
I mean, some will, some won't. Devil's in the details. So I think...
Can any? The quantities we're talking about are large.
So can any of the CO2 removal technologies scale so that, Dr. Evil could suck all the CO2 out of the air in 10 years? No. The volumes of CO2 involved are just so big that no. Could it scale so that you could avoid a climate catastrophe by removing CO2 quickly? I think the answer is essentially no. Right. Could it scale at a level where it could play a meaningful role in managing the overall carbon burden this century? I believe the answer is yes.
Wow. And do you like the biotech approach that we heard about in the first panel?
I like it if it works. I think that, lots of stuff needs to get more research. The way I did the math, knowing the size of Texas, if I looked it up right, the quote we heard was more than 10 watts per square meter. And that's not counting all the infrastructure. And that is a very high number compared to other numbers for sort of biological systems. And if it's achievable, that's awesome. We can get out of a lot of other work. But I think that's certainly not a consensus view at this point.
It also raises a question in my mind of where that Texas is. Presumably it's distributed for the whole world.
That's right.
Can some of it be on the oceans where parts that you don't otherwise care about, or in the Sahara parts you otherwise don't care about?
Let me actually push back more on the biology. This is an argument that actually Rob Sokla and I had with Steve Chu before he was Energy Secretary. And I want to follow the following kind of either-or proposition. If bioenergy systems are more or less like current bioenergy, where we grow hybrid poplars or whatever, then the following statement is pretty much true. If you want to take a significant bite out of the climate problem using those methods, the environmental impact from appropriating land from nature is just gigantic by any scale. Remember, in England, where the Industrial Revolution started, we switched to be more than half fossil fueled in the 1790s or so. And that was basically because we'd cut all the trees down. And the idea that we're going to run a world on this scale with this energy use, with a significant amount of biomass in that form, I think is pretty unlikely to be real. Now, if we have some real breakthrough that allows us to get orders of magnitude higher, we heard about 2 orders of magnitude earlier, then that equation changes. But I think the question we pushed Steve Chu on at that point had this role in the BP-funded effort at Princeton, at Berkeley, was if you really find a way to re-engineer photosynthesis so it's a lot better, as there are people trying to do, should we worry about runaway green goop running over the whole world and outcompeting other things? And the biologists always tend to pat me on the head and say, you're a physicist, you don't understand, there's no problem. And I'm not reassured. I am reassured.
There's no problem.
Oh, good. Let's push back a little bit. I mean, it's true that the current GMOs seem to be benign and actually pretty environmental beneficial because they've reduced use of pesticides. But they're also pretty minor modifications. If you really doubled or tripled the underlying efficiency of the photosynthetic process, it seems to be a lot more plausible that I have something that really outcompetes natural things, and that really might be a problem. And I mean, so tell me why I'm wrong.
Because the microbes of the world have been blasting away at all of these issues for 3.5 billion years, and they've not discovered green goo, or gray goo. And that means that if one of us invents something that we think might be green goo, some Omshin Rikyu type of terrorist who wants to bring down everything, let's all starve each other to death, that'll be fun. That set of labs could create some green goo and would get about as far as the parking lot before the existing microbes would eat it. Because this is a highly horizontally engineered system that's been going on for billions of years, and it is really inventive on an hourly basis, including in your and my guts this very second. I mean,
agreed. But if I've got plant
that makes
A
me conservative,
and engineered plant B, and plant B has a photosynthetic engine that's got twice the horsepower, both of them are preyed on by everything from birds to grazers to microbes or what have you. But if one of them's got twice as big an engine, now both of them are in some equilibrium. So I'm not actually worried about gray goo taking over everything. I agree. There's equilibriums. So I'm not worried that one will overrun the whole world and choke everything out. But I am worried that one with twice the engine will overrun the first one, both competing, both under pressure of things eating them. And I don't think your argument has convinced me otherwise.
Well, we've had C3 and C4 types of plants for a while. And
That's
the C4
true.
types of plants like sugar cane and so on, cane and corn, are drastically more efficient than grass, than the things that we've had for ever so long in our C3. They did not take over the world. They definitely filled a number of niches, and there's good scientific research going ahead in the Philippines and elsewhere to try to convert things like wheat from C3 to C4, just to get a whole lot more food for the amount of fertilizer and water especially that you put into it. That would be good. They're not going to get loose in the woods. These things don't get loose in the woods because the woods are absolutely deadly conflict. The one case you've had recently, people are saying, oh my gosh, it turns out some of these engineered canolas that are herbicide resistant are leaving the fields. And where are they going? They're going to the roadsides.
Understood.
Well, who gives a damn? They're not going out in the woods because there's no glyphosate, there's no Roundup, there's no herbicides out in the woods. What's out in the woods is all the other creatures. They're very good at being there, and this is a boxer in a gunfight. Well, where the boxer is in a boxing fight is along the margin of the road where they're also using glyphosate. So that's as wild as it's gotten so far.
I totally buy that argument for glyphosate. But I'm not sure that argument tells me much about the competition between two plants. One of them has twice the motor, assuming that could be done.
Well,
maybe we'll just agree to...
This will continue.
This is a conversation in which I'm struck that Washington is utterly irrelevant. I mean, here we in Washington like to think that the people will come to us
right,
at 19th and L and ask us for funding and permission And this sounds like Washington is going to be lucky to be informed after the experiment is already underway, privately funded. Is that the world we're looking at?
The rule is government is the last to find out what's going on. And the great example in this was the Jasons years ago when they were set up, the scientists who were sort of overseeing a lot of the stuff from the technical standpoint, physicists mostly.
Sadly.
And when they were first set up, Freeman Dyson was recalling they got their security clearances and all of the secrets were revealed to them that were relevant to their domain, which was nearly everything. And the scientists looked at each other and said, "That's it?" And then they said, "We hate to inform you, you're about 10 years behind." And so what they actually brought was not that they now could function with the secret information. What they could do is let the people who lived in that sequestered secret world know what was actually going on out in the real world. And that keeps happening. You see it still with the intelligence community. So, this is what your point is, that this is stuff which will arrive, like birth control pills, for which there was not a lot of permission or funding requested from the government. They just arrived, and then now everybody has to deal with it.
So not only the innovations in climate and geoengineering are going to come from individuals, but the solutions to the screw-ups in geoengineering are going to come from private individuals?
I think Brad Allenby said it well as a systematic thing, that I see a combination of two sorts of problems. Maybe this isn't exactly what Brad said. One is that we've added more and more checks and balances to government, each well-intentioned, each individual law well-intentioned, but the net result is our government seems less able to be responsive to change. And at the same time, we've got an accelerating pace of innovation. And so the gap between government's ability to get on top of new technologies and the pace of their evolution seems to be getting worse. And that's true for these complicated coupled systems in ways that are really a challenge for governance.
So the governance question now is sort of going to be the great question of this century. With accelerating technology and, by the way, accelerating science, you've got one major nation run by lawyers, that's us, and another major nation run by engineers and scientists, and that's China, who haven't evolved a full set of checks and balances yet. One hopes they will, but in the meantime, they can do big engineering projects in a short time and are accustomed to doing it. This is not arriving from the private sector for them, it's arriving from the government sector. So that'll be the standoff. That's one of the reasons I asked early on what's going on in China in this domain. They have droughts. They have typhoons that are hitting parts of their coast that haven't done that before. They have ocean level rise, even as small as it's been so far, especially in South China, which is consequential. They're used to fixing their own damn problems. But what's your perception on that?
I think this problem, the problem of government, the U.S. government in particular, not really being as in charge as it ought to be, is actually worse for, say, biotech or human genomic manipulation than it is for geoengineering. So I think for biotech or human genomic manipulation, these things can just happen all over, and it doesn't take one big experiment, and it can happen between consensual adults and their doctor behind closed doors, and it is happening. And I think, and it's pretty clear that if we say you can't make genetic choices about your kids here, that rich people will just go elsewhere, and then you'll have this increasing deficits perhaps between rich and poor. I think with geoengineering, there are several of these things that, clearly government has a natural nexus of authority to act. And so I actually think that it may be sort of overstated for some of the geoengineering things. I think it's very important that the U.S. government begin to have some kind of at least small research program now, not so much because I think that a little additional R&D money is needed, but because in order to be a legitimate player in having a conversation about governance, one that hopefully includes environmental groups and labor groups and the whole gamut of social society, civil society, that government, the way it exercises that is to have a small research program. So that's why I think other of us working here believe there should be one, but that having it linked to governance from the beginning is pretty important.
And that makes Professor Schelling's point that basically how the research goes forward will drastically determine how the actual deployment goes forward, if and when.
I think Schelling hit it right on there. Yeah.
What happens when the Russians decide that they're having their forest fires outside of Moscow, when it's all Bill Gates and David Keith's fault, and they're going to demonize you as Dr. Evil and maybe worse. What happens then?
Well, remember, geoengineering is an act of war.
Well,
Privately financed.
like I said, you're the professional provocateur. So, I mean, I think the answer is responsible private citizens, and I definitely think of Mr. Gates in that light, are very careful about drawing boundaries, so that I mean, that funding is very limited, and it's been very clear that it has not, I mean, explicitly clear that it's not for deployment.
What difference does that make if the Russians decide that they're going to pin this one on you?
I think I've got bigger things to worry about. But actually, let me pick up on the Russian assumption. I mean, I actually think that the sort of local nut jobs are a more serious assumption. So we, as I sort of alluded to, we actually had to call the police from a guy who works at a local auto detailing store who read about how I was a mass murderer on the internet and thought maybe he should do something about making the world safer. So that actually is a more immediate, real concern. But I want to talk a little bit about lock-in, because you sort of implied that the Russians, after the fire, would be more concerned to cool things down. But of course, Russia, just like here, isn't a single unitary entity. There's very different interests inside it. And there are other Russian interests that want oil and gas that might want it to warm up. So one of my personal worries is a kind of...
And agriculture.
Yeah. Is a kind of lock-in. So there are people in my town, in Calgary, who would be really happy to have more chances for oil and gas in the high Arctic. And if the climate is, let's say it's 2030 and it's got a little warmer and they've got a bunch of sunk assets in the high Arctic, and now let's say a bunch of environmentally driven groups, and maybe I'd be happy to be part of them, have agreed we're going to do just a little bit of geoengineering to cool the Arctic off a little bit, and we're thinking how great this is going to be for the gentleman who's trying to store his meat below ground, or the polar bears, or what have you, and that perfectly legitimate thing for us to think. My friends at Calgary are going to be saying, compensate us. We got assets at risk there. You make it colder. I don't care what the climate was 100 years ago. The climate there is now. We built these things with the assumption that it was going to warm up, and if you're going to cool it, we want compensation. Or we're going to block your cooling of it. So I fear that as we warm up, we're going to get lock-in that makes it very hard politically to go backwards.
There's a very interesting global asymmetry north and south, which is that the continents in the north get wider as they go north, and the continents in the south get narrower as they go south. So as people migrate away from the hot tropical zones, there's a lot of room to migrate in the north and a lot of potential advantage. And by the way, the shipping lanes are now opening up in the Northwest Passage above Canada and in the Northern Sea Route above Russia, which is itself a big event. Plus there's also new fossil fuel capabilities being explored there. None of these things are true in the south. Something like 5 out of 6 people live in the developing world, most of which is in the global south. And what have we just defined? We've just defined a form of hemispheric combat driven by global warming.
Not the geographic south. I'm trying to think of this in my head.
Say again?
The global south, though, not the geographic south.
Not
right?
entirely,
India and China are both...
But enough.
Yeah.
I mean, most of Africa,
yeah.
Those aspects of Latin America,
yeah.
Those aspects of South Asia.
No,
China clearly is in the north.
I mean, my big fears about geoengineering, I'm certainly worried about unexpected side effects technically, but I actually think there are ways to do a decent job if we were rational about trying to detect those as we ramped it up. My big fears are mostly not about that. It's about the interaction between this power and the political systems of the world in ways that could be really awful and lead to wars. That is really the root of my concerns about this.
Well, my sense is that we sort of got mostly through the existential test of the Cold War, of nuclear confrontation, by the skin of our teeth, but we seem to have gotten mostly through it. If we have a nuclear confrontation now, it'll be India-Pakistan level rather than Soviet Union, United States. And this is the new one. This is, as I grew up with the nuclear threat, young people now are growing up with the climate threat. And the world problem that they're facing in their lifetimes and in this century is not a nuclear confrontation, it's a climate confrontation. But it's a completely different kind of story. In a sense, the Cold War was decided by two national governments at a very high level behind veils of secrecy. As we've determined here, basically all of the players in the climate story are all of the players in the world who are emitting greenhouse gases every time they breathe, among other things. And it is, we've talked about unilateral potential things that might happen, but it is unlikely that a unilateral thing could play out very far before somebody just shoots down the aircraft or whatever it is if they don't like what's happening. Or you
Agreed.
didn't ask my permission, so and in fact, you can see more problems likely from there are so many easy ways to turn off solar radiation management, and turning it on and keeping it on and then adjusting the dial is much more difficult to contemplate. Turning it off is really easy to see how it could happen.
Yeah.
So that's what we're facing in young people's lifetimes, is sorting that one out. It's about a century-long problem, as near as I can tell.
People focus on the issues about the irreversibility or reversibility of these climate engineering technologies, and they should. It's the right question to ask. But the big issue here seems to me the biggest risk to be concerned about is the relative or near irreversibility of putting CO2 in the air. The fact that this lasts for centuries timescale alters the climate way into the future.
Is there a silver lining here? The good news about almost wiping out the planet with nuclear weapons is that it forced us to create new ways of thinking, like game theory. Mm-hmm. It established, which arguably saved the human race because you figured out how to cooperate with people who you couldn't trust. Is there going to be a silver lining like this, that this crisis is going to force us into a new way of thinking that we haven't had before, comparable to the one that we saw in the 50s that was caused by that existential threat?
Well, this was Jane Long's point, that is, what if we develop a societal capacity to deal with this kind of problem? And it's one of the reasons I like the term geoengineering. I really like climate engineering as being really specific about what we're talking about. But geoengineering has this additional aspect to it of including a whole set of problems. And eradicating smallpox was geoengineering. If we step up to reducing asteroid threat to zero, which we can do with present technology, that would be geoengineering. No more craters, no more pruning of the evolutionary tree, as our friend Rusty Schweikert says. But we would like that because big asteroids are big trouble. The mechanisms of fixing that are clear and present. And if we step up to that, I like that one as a sort of a practice one. Because when you deal with technology and with science that we have now, there's not a lot of mysteries about how asteroids behave. And then that set of social capacities, political capacities, economic capacities, cultural capacities, then can deal with this kind of issue, that would be pretty terrific. So I think the idea that people move toward carrots and away from sticks, having that carrot in the picture is a good one to have. On the other hand, there are other people going to say, that's you're just going to have black helicopters coming from the United Nations to come and tell everybody what to do. So take that one off the table. This is not world government, but it is a kind of global governance that if we're going to have a global economy, which we do, and we have a global climate and global atmosphere, which we do, we've had some experience of dealing with a global ocean, and some of that's worked out and some of it still remains to be worked out. These are all in the same category of issues that are not impossible to deal with.
We are evolving global governance bit by bit, and it's not, as you say, black helicopters. It's all the little network of treaties governing everything from frequencies, space control, to infectious diseases, et cetera, committees, treaties, norms. So it's happening. And the fact that we managed to get through all these decades of the nuclear age without blowing it in a big way is absolutely fantastic and a tribute to common sense, actually, the political leaders, which is, if you think about each of those stories, and in many cases, at the times we almost blew it, it was the technocrats who said the wrong thing and the political leaders in charge who actually finally made the right call not to do it.
I see we've got 2 minutes. Let me just ask one more question. So, Stuart, you're president of the Long Now Foundation. You're thinking out there as far out. So let's take a relatively short period of time, 500 to 1,000 years from now. What are we going to be most grateful about looking back on today?
That this particular problem turned up fortuitously at the same time we had the tools to recognize it and deal with it. It could have gone another way. It could have been that we got irreversibly down this path and then realized too late that we needed to do something.
That this problem, both geoengineering and climate change, made us think hard about separating issues that are purely kind of human convenience, how much food we eat, how safe we are, from the real, though hard to define, values of leaving some of nature more or less as we found it, because it's the heritage of all of us. And I think if we navigate this successfully, we will come to some view about environmental protection that isn't the 18th century view that recognizes the power that humans have, but that still says that this isn't just about maximizing human welfare, because that really gets you to a world with no nature that I think in the end won't be good for humans, not because they'll die, but because it's an important social and mental fact to have a connection to a natural world.
So you're saying this is going to give us an opportunity to get in touch with our souls?
That's my optimistic outcome. I can give you lots of pessimistic ones. Joel, I actually have a Freeman Dyson quote here I was going to read. You can indulge me?
Sure.
Science and technology, like all the original creations of the human spirit, are unpredictable. If we had a reliable way to label our toys good or bad, it would be easy to regulate technology wisely. But we can rarely see far enough ahead to know which road leads to damnation. Whoever concerns himself with big technology, either to push it forward or to stop it, is gambling with human lives. That's from Disturbing the Universe. And I think that's really the way I see this. It's very hard to guess which way this goes, but we're gambling with those stakes.
I want to hear, we've had two environmentalist optimists talking here. You've never been known for your optimism. So I'd like the last word to go to Joel Garreau, just to put a sufficiently edge on what we leave with here.
Well, I'm rooting against the techno-determinist scenarios. You know, the ones that say that we're the prisoners of our technologies and we're along for the ride. I don't like the literary qualities of that story. I mean, if it was going to be a summer blockbuster movie, it would be everything's out of control. There's nothing we can do about it. Hang on tight. The end. With incredible special effects, but not much plot. I don't like that. That's why I'm rooting for the humanistic version, which says that what matters is not how many transistors or sulfuric acid particles you can put together. It's how many ornery, unpredictable, imaginative, baffling humans you can hook up. And so I'm rooting for the bottom-up scenario that looks an awful lot like Exodus, which is it's just one damn thing after another.
And this qualifies as one big damn thing.
Right, exactly. On that note,
thank you.
Thank you guys very much.